5 years ago, she walked out on me when I was bankrupt, claiming she wasn't built for the basement. Now I'm a billionaire at the top of the world, and she's back at my door drenched in rain, begging me to hide her from the killers who are already in the elevator. The rain in the city doesn't just fall, it colonizes. It seeps into the cracks of the pavement, turns the air into a heavy gray curtain, and forces everyone into the artificial warmth of their own curated lives. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, the world below looks like a blurred watercolor painting, shimmering lights, rushing umbrellas, and the distant muffled hum of a world that never stops moving. I poured myself a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid catching the soft glow of the recessed lighting. I've spent the last 5 years building this sanctuary. Every piece of Italian leather, every automated shade, every silent corner of this apartment is a fortress built to keep the past out. I've spent millions to ensure that I never have to feel vulnerable again. I've become a man of routines, a man of cold logic, a man who knows exactly what he's worth down to the last decimal point. But 5 years ago, I was worth exactly 0. Actually, I was worth less than 0. I was a negative asset, a walking liability, a man drowning in a storm far more violent than the one currently battering my windows. I remember that time with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. I had poured everything, my savings, my inheritance, my very soul, into a tech startup that was supposed to be my legacy. For 2 years, it was glorious. I was the golden boy. I had the sleek office, the glowing press, releases, and I had Elena. Elena was the kind of woman who commanded the air in any room she entered. She was radiant, sharp, and seemingly my fiercest supporter. We were the it couple of the local tech scene. She would sit in my office, her hand on my shoulder, whispering about how we were going to conquer the world together. I believed her. I loved her with a desperation that blinded me to the shifting winds. Then, the collapse happened. It wasn't a slow leak. It was a catastrophic hull breach. A major investor pulled out under suspicious circumstances, a key patent was challenged in court, and within 3 months, I was hemorrhaging money faster than I could count it. The sleek office was seized. My bank accounts were frozen. The people who used to laugh at my jokes stopped answering my calls. I remember the night it all finally broke. I was sitting on the floor of our half-empty apartment, surrounded by boxes and legal notices. My father had passed away just a week prior, and the grief was a physical weight on my lungs, making every breath a struggle. I had no money for a funeral. I had no money for rent. I was a shell of a man, shivering in the dark because I couldn't afford the utility bill. Elena walked in that night, but she wasn't carrying groceries or words of comfort. She was wearing her best trench coat, and she had 2 suitcases standing by the door. "I can't do this, Mark," she had said. No tears, no hesitation. Her voice was as cold as the radiator. "Elena, please," I'd whispered, my voice cracking. "I just need a few weeks. I'm restructuring. I have a plan." She looked around the dim room with a sneer of pure disgust. "You don't have a plan. You have a disaster. I didn't sign up for this. I'm not built for the basement, Mark. I'm not a martyr for your failed dreams." I reached for her hand, a pathetic, instinctive gesture of a drowning man, but she recoiled as if my touch were infectious. "You're a liability now," she said, her eyes dead. "And I don't stay with liabilities. I've already called an Uber. Don't try to find me." She walked out and closed the door. The sound of that lock clicking into place was the last thing I heard before I collapsed onto the floor. I stayed there for 2 days. I lost my home, my reputation, and the woman I thought was my soulmate, all in the span of a single season. I was at my absolute lowest point, a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart that felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. The years that followed were a blur of agonizing labor. I worked 3 jobs, I slept in a shelter, I bartered, I scavenged, and slowly, with a bitterness that fueled me more than any ambition ever could, I rebuilt. I found a gap in the market that my old company had missed. I worked 18-hour days for 4 years straight. I didn't date. I didn't socialize. I became a machine designed for one purpose: survival. And I survived. I didn't just survive, I conquered. Now I'm the CEO of a firm that makes my old startup look like a lemonade stand. I have the power, the money, and the cold, hard shell that ensures no one can ever hurt me like that again. The chime of my doorbell echoed through the silent penthouse, startling me out of my thoughts. I frowned, checking the time on my watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. My security team down in the lobby usually vets every guest, but they hadn't called. I set my glass down on the marble coaster and walked toward the door. The video feed on the wall-mounted tablet flickered to life as I approached. A woman stood in the hallway. She was drenched, her hair matted against her forehead, her expensive-looking coat stained with mud and city grime. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she clutched a small, worn handbag. She looked nothing like the polished queen who had walked out on me 5 years ago, yet the features were unmistakable. It was Elena. My heart, which I thought I had successfully turned to stone, gave a strange, violent thud. I stood frozen, watching her through the camera. She looked up at the lens, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate, as if she knew I was watching. She reached out a shaking hand and pressed the buzzer again, a long, pleading tone that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I felt a surge of cold fury, followed by a dark, twisted sense of irony. She had left me when I was in the basement because she wasn't built for it. And now, here she was, standing at the door of my palace in the clouds, looking like she had been living in that very basement she despised. I reached for the handle, my fingers hovering over the cold metal. I should ignore her. I should call security and have her escorted out of the building. I should let her feel the cold rain she was so happy to leave me in. But curiosity, or perhaps a lingering, masochistic ghost of the man I used to be, took over. I pulled the door open. The hallway air was cool, but the look in her eyes was freezing. She stared at me, her mouth falling open as she took in my tailored clothes, the vast, luxurious expanse of the apartment behind me, and the unmistakable aura of a man who no longer needed anything from anyone. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice a ragged shadow of what it once was. I didn't step back to let her in. I stood in the center of the frame, blocking the warmth of my home. "You're 5 years late for an apology, Elena," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "What are you doing here?" She took a shuddering breath, a tear tracing a path through the rain on her cheek. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask how I was. She looked past me, into the light of the penthouse, and spoke the words I never thought I'd hear from her. "Mark, I have nowhere else to go. They're coming for me, and I need you to hide me." Before I could respond, the elevator at the end of the hall dinged, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their eyes immediately locking onto her. The men didn't run. They didn't shout. They walked with the synchronized, rhythmic pace of predators who knew the cage was already locked. They were dressed in charcoal gray suits that screamed corporate enforcement, the kind of men who disappear problems for people with more money than God. Elena's eyes went wide, reflecting the sterile light of the hallway. She looked at the men, then back at me, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "Please," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, if they get me, I'm dead. I know what I did. I know I don't deserve a second of your time, but please, just tonight." My mind was a hurricane of conflicting impulses. One part of me, the part that still felt the phantom chill of that empty apartment 5 years ago, wanted to laugh in her face and step back, letting the heavy oak door swing shut. I wanted to watch her face as the men reached her. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of being abandoned when the world was closing in. But another part, the part that had spent 5 years obsessing over the how and why of my downfall, saw something else. These men weren't just debt collectors. They moved like the security detail of the man who had orchestrated my ruin, Julian Vane. The elevator dings echoed again. A third man stepped out. This one was older, his hair a slick silver, carrying a briefcase like a weapon. "Mark," Elena hissed, grabbing the edge of my sleeve. Her fingers were ice. "I have the ledger, the real one, from the 21st floor. The name of my old firm's headquarters." The silver-haired man spotted her. He didn't speed up, but he raised a hand, signaling the two suits. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Let's not make a scene in such a prestigious building. Return the property and we can discuss your exit strategy." Fury and curiosity won the war inside me. I reached out, grabbed Elena by the shoulder, harder than I intended, and hauled her inside the penthouse. I slammed the door and threw the heavy deadbolt. Silence followed. A thick, suffocating silence that lasted only seconds before the electronic chime of my doorbell rang. Not a frantic buzzing, but a single polite request for entry. "Mark?" Elena was leaning against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She was shivering violently now, the expensive rug beneath her soaking up the rainwater. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go." "Shut up," I said, my voice sounding foreign even to me. It was the voice I used in boardrooms to terminate contracts. Cold, final. "Don't thank me. You're not here because I care if you live or die. You're here because you mentioned the 21st floor. If you're lying to me, I'll open that door myself." I walked over to the security monitor. The three men were standing in the hallway. The silver-haired one looked directly into the camera. He knew I was watching. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket, and a second later, my private line, the one only my inner circle had, began to vibrate on the marble counter. I picked it up. I didn't say hello. "Mr. Sterling," the voice on the other end said. It was the man in the hallway. "You've made quite a name for yourself these last few years. A true Phoenix story. It would be a shame if that story ended in a chapter titled Obstruction of Justice and Harboring a Fugitive." "I don't know who you are," I said, watching him through the screen, "and you're trespassing." "I'm Arthur Cross. I represent the interests of the Vane Group. The woman in your foyer has stolen highly sensitive, proprietary data. If you hand her over now, along with the bag she's carrying, we can overlook your momentary lapse in judgment. We can even discuss a potential partnership. Vane has been watching your progress with great interest." "Vane watched me go bankrupt 5 years ago," I spat. "He didn't seem interested in partnerships then." "Business is fluid, Mr. Sterling. People change. Circumstances change. But the law regarding theft remains quite rigid. You have 5 minutes to decide if you want to be a hero for a woman who left you for dead or a billionaire who knows how to spot a winning side." The line went dead. I turned back to Elena. She was clutching her handbag to her chest as if it were a shield. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes darting around my living room, taking in the wealth she had once deemed me incapable of providing. "Is it true?" I asked, walking toward her. "Did you steal from Vane?" "I didn't steal it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I took back what was yours. Mark, the collapse wasn't an accident. It wasn't just bad luck. Vane didn't just pull his investment. He planted the evidence of the patent infringement. He hired me to keep you distracted while they bled the accounts dry." The air left my lungs. I felt like I had been punched in the solar plexus. "He hired you?" She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "In the beginning, yes. But then I really did love you. But by then it was too late. They had leverage over my family. I had to leave. I thought if I stayed, they'd destroy you even more just to hurt me. I left to save you, Mark." "Save me?" I let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You left me in a room with no heat, Elena. You left me while I was mourning my father. You didn't save me. You executed me. And I've spent 5 years trying to find a way to fix it," she screamed, suddenly standing up. She fumbled with her bag, her hands shaking so much she nearly dropped it. She pulled out a sleek, black hardware drive. "This is it. This is the proof. The emails, the wire transfers, the names of the judges Vane paid off. Everything that happened to you is on this drive. I spent 3 years working as his personal assistant just to get close enough to his private server." I stared at the drive. It was a small piece of plastic and metal, but it held the power to dismantle the empire of the man who had destroyed my life. It was the one thing I had craved for half a decade, the truth. "Give it to me," I said, reaching out. She hesitated, pulling the drive back. "Not yet. You have to promise me, Mark. You have to get me out of the country. I have a sister in Spain. If Vane finds me, I'm a dead woman. Promise me you'll use your resources to get me away, and the drive is yours." The irony was sickening. 5 years ago, she wouldn't stay because I had no resources. Now she was selling me the truth in exchange for the very protection my success provided. "You're in no position to negotiate," I said, stepping closer. Suddenly, a loud, mechanical, grinding sound echoed from the front door. I looked at the monitor. The 2 suits weren't waiting anymore. One of them was holding a professional-grade electronic lockpick, while the other was attaching a small, localized thermal charge to the frame. They weren't waiting 5 minutes. They were coming in now. "Mark!" Elena shrieked. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the penthouse, toward the private elevator that led to the garage. But as I swiped my keycard, the lights in the entire apartment flickered and died. The backup generators should have kicked in instantly, but they didn't. The entire floor plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. In the gloom, I heard the heavy thud of my front door being kicked open. "Mark?" Elena's voice was a whimper in the dark. I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist. Not Elena's. It was a firm, masculine grip. A voice whispered directly into my ear, smelling of peppermint and expensive tobacco. "The drive, Mr. Sterling, and we might let you keep the apartment." But the voice didn't come from the front door. It came from the darkness of my own bedroom behind us. They were already inside. The hand on my wrist felt like a vice made of frozen steel. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. In the absolute blackness of the penthouse, the smell of peppermint and tobacco was suffocating, a clinical, sharp scent that didn't belong in a home. "You have a very expensive security system, Mr. Sterling," the voice whispered, smooth and devoid of any heat. "It's a shame the man who installed it is currently enjoying a very large wire transfer from the Vane Group. Loyalty is such an expensive commodity these days. Most people are willing to sell it at a discount." I didn't think. I reacted. 5 years of repressed rage, of nights spent staring at a concrete ceiling in a homeless shelter, exploded into a single, desperate movement. I wrenched my arm back and swung my other fist blindly into the dark. I felt the satisfying, sickening crunch of knuckles hitting bone. The man, Cross, let out a sharp grunt and his grip loosened. "Run!" I hissed, grabbing Elena's damp coat. I knew this floor plan like the back of my hand. I had designed every inch of it to be a fortress, and even in the dark I could navigate the ghost memory of the furniture. I hauled Elena toward the kitchen, my boots sliding on the spilled rainwater. Behind us, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thuds of the front door team finally breaching the foyer. Flashlights cut through the dark, the beams swinging wildly like searchlights in a storm. "There!" a voice shouted. We ducked behind the long marble kitchen island just as a red laser dot danced across the Italian cabinetry above our heads. "Mark, the drive!" Elena gasped, her voice thick with terror. She tried to shove it into my hand. "Take it! If they catch me, it's gone. You can still ruin him. You have the infrastructure now. You have the lawyers." "I'm not leaving you to get murdered in my kitchen, Elena," I snapped, though a part of me, the cold, logical part that had built this empire, was already calculating the risk. If I took the drive and left her, I could finish what Vane started. I could have my revenge. But then I looked at her. In the flickering light of the passing flashlights, she looked small. For the first time, I didn't see the woman who had walked out on me. I saw the girl I had fallen in love with in college, before the money, before the greed, before Julian Vane had turned our lives into a chessboard. "The service elevator," I whispered. "It's on its own circuit. If my head of security sold me out, he might have forgotten the freight line. It's manual." "They're blocking the hallway," she breathed. "We're not going through the hallway." I reached under the lip of the marble island and pulled a small, concealed lever, a feature I'd added for my own paranoia. A section of the floor-to-ceiling wine rack in the pantry clicked open. It wasn't a secret passage out of a movie. It was a narrow maintenance crawl space that led to the building's core. We scrambled inside, the smell of dust and cold grease replacing the peppermint. I pulled the rack shut just as the kitchen was flooded with light. Through the tiny gaps in the shelving, I saw the silhouettes of 3 men. They didn't look like guards. They looked like professional cleaners. "They aren't in the living room," one of them said. His voice was muffled but clear. "Cross, you okay?" "He broke my nose." Cross's voice came back, sounding nasal and livid. "The girl has the hardware. Vane doesn't want her alive if she's already accessed the encryption. Find them. Check the balcony. Check the vents. They haven't left the floor." I held my breath. My arm pressed against Elena's. She was trembling so hard I thought she might collapse. We crawled through the narrow space, the metal floor groaning under our weight. Every sound felt like a gunshot. Finally, we reached the heavy steel door of the freight elevator. I gripped the manual handle and pulled. It resisted for a second, then slid open with a low, metallic rasp that sounded like a scream in the quiet shaft. We scrambled into the lift. I slammed the gate shut and hammered the G button. The elevator lurched, a sickening drop in my stomach as we began to descend. "We're going to the garage?" Elena asked, leaning against the corrugated metal wall. "No," I said, watching the floor numbers glow dimly. "The garage is exactly where they'll expect us. We're going to the basement, the sublevel where the old boiler rooms are." "Why?" "Because there's a tunnel that connects to the subway system. It was built in the 40s for coal deliveries. No one uses it. Not even my security team knows it's there." Elena let out a long, shuddering breath. She looked at the hardware drive in her hand, then looked at me. "I'm sorry, Mark, for everything. I didn't think he'd come for you like this. I thought if I just got the data, I could disappear and leave you out of it." "You were never going to leave me out of it," I said, the bitterness returning. "Vane has been obsessed with me since the day I outperformed his son's firm. This wasn't about the data for him. It was about making sure I stayed down." The elevator jolted to a halt. The doors opened to a cavernous, dimly lit basement filled with the hum of massive machinery and the smell of damp earth. It was a stark contrast to the luxury above, a reminder of the world I had fought so hard to escape. We stepped out, our footsteps echoing on the wet concrete. I led her toward the back, past the looming shadows of the industrial heaters. "The tunnel entrance is behind that crate," I said, pointing toward a stack of rotting wooden boxes. But as we neared the corner, a light flickered on. Not a flashlight, but a single overhead bulb that hummed with yellow electricity. Standing in our path was a man I recognized. It wasn't Cross. It wasn't one of the suits. It was Miller, my head of security. He was holding a suppressed pistol, his face a mask of professional indifference. "I told them you'd come here, Mr. Sterling," Miller said. "You always were a fan of the old-school exits. You mentioned that tunnel during our first security audit. You should have kept your mouth shut." "How much, Miller?" I asked, stepping in front of Elena. "How much did Vane pay you to throw away 10 years of service?" "More than you pay me to watch you drink scotch and stare at the rain," Miller replied. He gestured with the gun. "The drive, Miss Vance. Toss it over. And Mark, don't be a hero. You've worked too hard to die in a basement." Elena's hand tightened on the drive. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a plan, a sign, anything. But for the first time in 5 years, I was out of moves. "Give it to him, Elena. I whispered. "Mark, no." "Give it to him," I yelled. She threw the drive. It skittered across the concrete, stopping at Miller's boots. He knelt down, keeping the gun trained on us, and picked it up. He tapped a button on his earpiece. "I have the package, bringing the targets up now." But as he stood up, he looked at the drive. His brow furrowed. He turned it over in his hand, his eyes widening. "What is this?" he hissed, looking back at us. "This isn't the ledger. This is a GPS tracker." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Elena. She wasn't looking at Miller anymore. She was looking at me, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Something cold, something triumphant. From the shadows of the tunnel behind us, the sound of rhythmic clapping echoed. A tall, slender figure stepped into the light, draped in a coat that cost more than my car. Julian Vane. "Well done, Elena," Vane said, his voice a smooth, upper-crust purr. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist playing the savior one last time. It's his greatest weakness. He thinks he's the hero of a story that ended years ago. I looked from Vane to Elena. She stepped away from me, moving toward Vane's side. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice now completely steady. "But I told you 5 years ago, I'm not built for the basement, and Vane promised me the penthouse." Vane smiled, pulling a second hardware drive, the real one, from his pocket. "The first one was just to see if you'd really changed, Mark, to see if you were still that same pathetic, sentimental boy, and you are." He nodded to Miller. Miller raised the gun, aiming it directly at my chest. "Wait," Elena said, her hand moving to Vane's arm. "Not yet. We need him to sign the transfer papers first. He still owns the intellectual property for the new encryption. If he dies now, the company goes into probate. We need the signature." Vane hummed thoughtfully. "You're right. Always so practical." He looked at me, a cruel glint in his eyes. "But we don't need his legs for a signature, do we?" Miller shifted his aim downward, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, the entire basement was rocked by a deafening explosion from the floor above. The ceiling cracked, and a shower of debris rained down, plunging us into a cloud of white dust and screaming alarms. Through the chaos, I heard a sound I didn't expect. A voice booming over the building's emergency intercom, one I hadn't heard in years. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have the building surrounded. Drop your weapons and identify yourselves." In the confusion, I felt a hand grab mine in the dark. "Now," a voice whispered. "If you want to live, you have to trust me one more time." But it wasn't Elena's voice. The dust was like ground glass in my lungs. A thick, chalky veil that turned the yellow emergency lights into ghostly, indistinct smudges. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world, but the grip on my hand was unmistakable. It was firm, purposeful, and lacked the trembling desperation of Elena's touch or the predatory ice of Miller's. "This way," the voice whispered. It was low, raspy, and carried a familiar cadence I hadn't heard in 5 years. "Sarah?" I coughed, the name tasting like ash. Sarah Jenkins, my former CFO, the woman who had been my right hand during the rise of my first company, and the one I thought had vanished into the witness protection program or a shallow grave after the collapse. She had been the only one who didn't look at me with pity or disgust when the lights went out. She had simply looked at me with a terrifyingly calm sadness before disappearing. "Don't talk. Just move," she commanded, pulling me through the swirling debris. Behind us, through the settling dust, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thuds of tactical boots hitting the concrete. The FBI, if it really was them, was moving in fast. But there was another sound, too, the frantic, high-pitched shouting of Julian Vane. "Find them, you idiot! Find the drive!" Vane's voice was stripped of its aristocratic polish, replaced by the raw, jagged edge of a man who realized his empire was built on a foundation of sand that was currently being washed away. "I can't see anything, sir." That was Miller. A gunshot rang out, the suppressed thwip followed by a spark as a bullet struck a metal pipe near my head. Hot steam hissed into the air, adding to the suffocating heat of the basement. Sarah led me behind a massive, rusted backup generator. She was dressed in dark tactical gear, a far cry from the power suits she used to wear. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and weary. "You were always a magnet for trouble, Mark. But I didn't expect you to let the snake back into the garden." "She said she had the ledger," I whispered, leaning against the vibrating metal. "She said she was trying to fix it." Sarah let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. "Elena Vance doesn't fix things. She harvests them. Vane used her to bait you, and he used you to bait me. He knew I'd be watching you. He knew if he put you in enough danger, I'd have to break cover to get the drive." "Wait, so you have the real data?" Sarah patted a heavy-duty pouch on her vest. "I've had it for months. What Elena brought you was a Trojan horse. The moment that hardware drive was plugged into your penthouse's local network, it started uploading your current firm's proprietary encryption keys directly to Vane's server. He didn't just want to ruin your past, Mark. He wanted to steal your future." The realization felt like a second explosion. Every move I'd made tonight, every instinct to protect her, had been a calculated step in my own execution. I hadn't been the hero of a second-chance romance. I had been the useful idiot in a corporate heist. "We have to go," Sarah said, checking the corner of the generator. "The tunnel you mentioned, the coal passage, it's compromised. Vane's men are at both ends, but there's a drainage pipe 4 levels down that leads to the old canal system." "Mark!" A scream pierced the gloom. It was Elena. It wasn't the triumphant voice of a woman who had won. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. I looked through the haze. The dust was thinning enough to see the center of the basement. Miller was holding Elena by the hair, his pistol pressed against her temple. Her face was a mask of blood and tears. Vane stood a few feet away, his expensive coat ruined, his face twisted in a snarl. "Sterling!" Vane roared. "I know you're in the shadows. You want to play the martyr? Here's your chance. Sarah Jenkins, I know you're with him. Give me the drive or I'll let Miller show Miss Vance exactly how built for the basement she really is." I felt Sarah's hand tighten on my arm. "Don't," she hissed. "It's a bluff. He won't kill her yet. She's his only witness if things go south." "Mark, please," Elena sobbed. "He's going to kill me. He said I failed. Please don't let them." I looked at the woman who had left me to starve, the woman who had just tried to steal everything I had built from the ashes. 5 years ago, I would have died for her. 5 minutes ago, I was ready to risk it all. Now, as I watched her grovel at the feet of the man who had truly destroyed us both, I felt a strange, cold clarity. "I'm not a liability anymore, Elena," I called out, my voice echoing off the damp walls. Vane's head snapped toward our position. "There you are. Miller, prep the girl." "I'm not coming out, Julian," I said, my voice gaining strength. "And I don't care about the girl. You can have her. You two deserve each other." The silence that followed was heavy. Elena's sobbing stopped, replaced by a low, broken whimper. Vane looked genuinely surprised. He was a man who played on people's emotions as if they were piano keys, and I had just snapped the wire. "You're lying," Vane said, though his voice wavered. "You're the man who spent a fortune on a funeral for a father you hadn't spoken to in years. You're the man who still keeps a photo of this traitor in your desk. You're weak, Sterling. That's why I won." "I was weak," I said, glancing at Sarah. She gave me a small, grim nod. "But I learned from the best. I learned that in this world there are assets and there are liabilities. And right now, Julian, you're looking at the man who just liquidated you." Sarah pulled a small remote from her pocket and pressed a button. Above us, the sounds of the FBI didn't stop. They intensified. But they weren't coming from the stairs. The FBI announcement blared again, but this time it glitched, the voice repeating the same syllable over and over. It wasn't a raid. It was a high-decibel acoustic distraction Sarah had rigged into the building's own emergency system. "Go!" Sarah yelled. We didn't run for the drainage pipe. We ran straight for the industrial lift. Miller fired, the bullets whining off the generator, but the distraction was enough. We dove into the lift, and Sarah slammed the manual lever. As we rose, I saw Vane frantically trying to reload his own weapon, his eyes wild with the realization that he had been played. But as the lift cleared the basement floor, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Elena hadn't stayed on her knees. In the chaos, she had lunged for Miller's dropped tactical bag. As the lift rose past the sightline, I saw her pull out a small black cylinder, a thermite charge. She didn't look at Vane. She didn't look at Miller. She looked straight up at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying, vengeful light. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to bring the whole building down on all of us. "Sarah, the lift," I started, but the words were cut off by a blinding flash of white-hot light from below. The lift cable snapped with a sound like a thunderclap. We didn't fall, but we didn't go up. We were jolted violently as the emergency brakes slammed into the rails, leaving us dangling in the dark shaft between floors. The heat from below began to rise instantly, a shimmering wave of orange light reflecting off the steel walls. "She's insane," Sarah breathed, clinging to the rail. "She's going to melt the structural supports." I looked down through the grating of the lift floor. Below us, the basement was a furnace, but through the flames, I saw a door opening at the very bottom of the shaft, a door that shouldn't have been there. A man stepped out into the fire wearing a protective suit that looked like it belonged in a lab. He didn't look at the fire. He didn't look at Vane. He looked up at the lift, and he raised a handheld radio to his mouth. "Target is secured in the shaft," the man said, his voice coming through clearly over the lift's own intercom system. "Initiate the extraction, and remember, Mr. Sterling is to be taken alive. His father's debt still hasn't been paid." I froze. My father hadn't died with a debt. He had died with nothing. "Sarah," I whispered, my heart stopping. "Who is that?" Sarah looked down, her face turning pale in the firelight. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine, unmitigated fear in her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling, "your father didn't lose the money 5 years ago. He hid it. And that man is the reason your father had to die in the first place." The heat from the thermite charge below was an invisible wall, pressing against the bottom of the lift. The air shimmered, thick with the scent of ozone and melting iron. We were suspended in a tomb of steel, caught between the furnace below and the unknown predators above. "My father is alive?" I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass. Sarah looked at me, her face smeared with soot, her eyes reflecting the orange glow from the shaft. "He had to be dead for you to be safe, Mark. Thomas didn't just build a company. He built a backdoor into the global banking architecture, the Sterling Protocol. Vane didn't want your startup 5 years ago. He wanted that protocol. Your father faked his death and drained his own accounts to make it look like the money was gone. He turned you into a nobody so you wouldn't be a target." "He let me sleep in a shelter," I roared, the betrayal of the present crashing into the betrayal of the past. "He let me starve. Because if you had even a penny of that money, they would have found you," Sarah shouted over the roar of the fire. "But you were too smart, Mark. You rebuilt. You became a giant again on your own merit, and by doing that, you put yourself back on their radar. Vane was just the bloodhound. The men in the suits, they're the hunters." The lift groaned, then lurched upward. It wasn't the smooth movement of a functioning elevator. We were being winched up by a heavy-duty cable from the roof. I looked down through the floor, grating one last time. The basement was a lake of fire. I saw a figure, Elena, staggering through the smoke. She was screaming, clutching her handbag, the very thing she thought would buy her a life of luxury. Behind her, Julian Vane was fighting with Miller for a gas mask. They were shadows in a hell of their own making, consumed by the greed that had defined them. I felt a hollow pang of grief for the woman Elena could have been, but it was quickly replaced by the cold, hard shell of the man I had become. "They're taking us to the roof," Sarah said, checking her weapon. "The syndicate, the men who employed the hazmat team, they don't want the ledger mark. They want the biometric key, and that key isn't on a drive." The lift slammed into the top floor stops. The doors were ripped open by hydraulic spreaders. The roof of the penthouse was a battlefield. A black, silent helicopter sat on the helipad, its rotors slowly beginning to turn. Rain lashed across the concrete, cooling the steam rising from the lift shaft. A dozen men in tactical gear stood in a semicircle, their weapons trained on us. In the center stood the man from the basement, his hazmat hood removed. He was older, with a face like etched granite and eyes that had seen too much of the world's dark corners. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I am Director Ward. Your father sends his regards and his regrets. Where is he?" I stepped out of the lift, Sarah close behind me. "In a secure location, one you will join shortly," Ward said. He held out a hand. "But first, we need to close the loop. The Sterling protocol is active, but it's locked. It requires a specific biometric frequency, one that can only be provided by the vocal cords of a direct descendant. The debt your father owes us is the activation of that protocol. We use it to monitor the very people who tried to destroy you tonight." "And if I refuse?" Ward smiled, a thin, humorless line. "Then we leave you here for the local police. They're about 5 minutes away, along with the records we've carefully planted in your private server that link you to the accidental fire that killed Julian Vane and Elena Vance. You'll be the prime suspect in a double homicide and corporate arson. Your empire will be seized. You'll be back in the basement, Mark. This time, for life." I looked at Sarah. She was silent, her eyes telling me that this was the choice I had been moving toward for 5 years. I could be the victim, the survivor, or the architect. "Mark, don't do it for them," Sarah whispered. "Do it for the truth. Once the protocol is active, we can expose Vane's entire network, not just him, but the people who funded him. We can finish it." I looked at Ward, then at the burning building beneath my feet. I thought of the cold nights, the hunger, the clicking of the lock when Elena walked out. I thought of my father, the man who had loved me enough to let me suffer so that I could live. I took a step toward Ward. I didn't feel like a billionaire, and I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a man who was finally taking the steering wheel of a car that had been careening off a cliff for a decade. "What do I have to say?" I asked. Ward handed me a small, encrypted handset. I held it to my lips. My voice was steady, cold, and carried the weight of every trial I had endured. "System override, Sterling Alpha 9. Confirm identity, Mark Sterling." The handset chirped. A green light pulsed. Across the city, in hidden servers and high-rise banks, the legacy of my father began to hum, a digital ghost finally given a voice. "Extraction complete," Ward said into his radio. He gestured toward the helicopter. "Welcome back to the world, Mr. Sterling. It's a lot bigger than you imagined." As we boarded the helicopter, I looked down at the penthouse. The windows were blowing out from the heat, glass raining down like diamonds onto the city streets. My fortress was gone. My sanctuary, built on the bitterness of the past, was being consumed by the flames. I sat in the back of the chopper as it lifted off, the city shrinking beneath us. Sarah sat opposite me, her hand finally relaxing on her weapon. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To see your father," she said. The helicopter banked, turning away from the glowing embers of my old life and heading toward the dark, vast horizon. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I had lost my home, my company, and the woman I thought I loved. I had discovered my life was a lie, and my father was a phantom. But as the wind whipped through the cabin, I realized for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't running. I was the storm. The penthouse faded into a small orange spark in the distance. Below it, in the wreckage, the names of Vane and Elena would be buried in the headlines of a corporate tragedy. But for me, the story wasn't over. It was just getting started. I closed my eyes, the roar of the engines finally drowning out the ghosts of the basement, and for the first time, I slept without the fear of the door closing. I was Mark Sterling, and I had finally inherited my kingdom.